The truth behind USA guitar brands that no one wants to admit. Hey everybody, Jace Allen here. Welcome back to the channel. So for some people, the guitar buying mantra goes like this: buy American or buy Chinese or Indonesian or Korean junk and support the communists and slave child labor. I can't tell you how many comments I've received on my videos about budget guitars from China where the viewer claims that buying a Chinese-made guitar means I'm supporting the Chinese Communist Party or that I'm okay with child slave labor. First, to agree with their comments, you'd have to ignore the most obvious and glaring hypocrisy, and that is, the person leaving the comment is most likely typing that comment on an iPad, an iPhone, an Android device, a laptop, or even their TV, which are all most likely made, you guessed it, in China. And they're posting that comment over a network that is built largely on equipment manufactured in China. So it boggles my mind how ignorant someone can be to climb up on their moral high horse when it comes to the topic of guitars, yet exercise moral ambiguity when it comes to the nearly 17% of goods consumed in the US each year coming from China. It seems that some guitar enthusiasts are practicing a sort of selective amnesia when it comes to products made in China. Guitars made in China? Bad. Smartphones and other electronic devices made in China? A-OK. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, is the idea that buying a guitar made in the USA somehow absolves the buyer of the sins of supporting communism or slave labor. But here's the truth that these folks don't want to admit. Companies like Fender, Gibson, and PRS are all complicit when it comes to exploiting cheap labor in other countries, including, yes, China, and are therefore also guilty of supporting the Chinese Communist Party. Let's explore what I mean by this. In the case of Fender and Gibson, the companies have had multiple owners since they were purchased from their founders. CBS purchased Fender from Leo Fender in 1965. Gibson sold to Chicago Musical Instruments in 1944. Now, these two companies are owned in part by private equity firms. What began as a small local guitar builder turned into large international brands, with operations expanding to other parts of the world, particularly Asian countries such as Indonesia, China, Korea, and Vietnam. This was in an effort to not only compete with cheaper guitars also being made in those countries, but also to be even more profitable. Not only have these companies set up shop in other countries to exploit cheaper labor and in some cases lax environmental laws, they have also bought up rival companies within the musical instrument space. Gibson also owns Epiphone, Kramer, Steinberger, Mesa Boogie, and KRK systems. Much of these brands are made in China. Fender also owns Squier, Gretsch, Jackson, Charvel, and EVH, many of which are made in Asian factories. Fender also maintains a guitar factory in Mexico. PRS guitars also have some of their lower priced guitars made in Indonesia. I think you can see where I'm headed with all this. Unless you are buying your guitars from a small US-based builder like, say, Texas Toast, and that builder buys all their hardware for the guitars domestically, which incidentally is almost impossible to do, you are indirectly supporting the so-called slave labor and also supporting the Chinese Communist Party, or whatever government is ruling the country the guitars are made in. There are no two ways to look at it. You as a guitar player can scream from the mountaintops all you want that buying Chinese-made guitars is somehow morally reprehensible, but you are just as complicit as the rest of us when you buy that Gibson Les Paul or USA Fender Telecaster. I don't know if some people just think of Epiphone and Squier as somehow separate from Gibson and Fender, but those are simply other brands under their entire corporate umbrellas. If buying a guitar from, say, Firefly or Harley Benton is wrong because it supports communism, then buying a guitar from Fender and Gibson is no different. You may think that buying USA-made guitars is simply the lesser of two evils, but in reality, that's just a way to soothe your conscience and allow you to cast judgment on other people in an effort to present yourself in a more favorable light. The truth is, the entire system is built on exploiting labor for profit. Not just guitar building, but almost any manufacturing process. This is why automation, robots, CNC machines, and now AI have replaced human workers, because manufacturers are trying to make as much profit as possible, and the fewer people they have to pay, the better. Take Epiphone, for example. Most of the Epiphone branded guitars are made in China. In fact, Gibson set up a dedicated factory in China to build Epiphone guitars. This means that money from Gibson guitar sales was used to either purchase or lease space in China and employ Chinese labor to build those guitars. And try as you may, you cannot separate Gibson from Epiphone. They are both owned by private equity firm Kohlberg Kravis Roberts. And so any money that flows into the Gibson brand enriches the company that also owns the Epiphone brand. You may feel okay morally with your decision to buy a Gibson, but the numbers don't lie. I think most people who buy guitars, whether they are made in the US or China, have at least a basic understanding that we live in a global economy whether we like it or not, and that the money you spend on products may or may not be used for purposes for which you oppose. It's just the way it works. It takes a great deal of research and effort to purchase goods from ethical companies. This not only means treating workers ethically, but also being good stewards to the environment and supporting humanitarian causes. I'm not under any illusions that the people crying about slave labor in the comments of my videos actually care about the lives of people living in China. If they did, they would boycott places like Amazon and Walmart. They are just flexing what they feel is their moral superiority. They are showing everyone how loyal and patriotic they are to the US. I'm not sure how guitar buying became such a big political and moral statement. I've read that the musical instrument industry has lifted many rural Chinese out of poverty. If the people complaining about slave labor really cared about the actual people living and working in China, then they would see the boom in Chinese guitar building as a positive. But Jace, you ask, what about slave labor? Well, you're right to be concerned about forced labor. But from everything I have read, the musical instrument industry in China is not using forced labor of any kind, and certainly not child labor. Does that mean that all the workers in China building guitars are happy, treated properly, and making a fair wage? No. But I don't think the workers building guitars in the US are necessarily all happy, treated fairly, and making a fair wage either. Another thing is, forced labor is a problem worldwide, not just in China. In fact, VoicesForFreedom.org estimates that for every 1,000 people living in the US, 1.3 of them are living in modern slavery. Modern slavery is seen in jobs like domestic work, agriculture, farm work, traveling sales crews, restaurant or food services, and health and beauty services. Up to 30% of farm worker families are living below the federal poverty line, experiencing situations of modern slavery where they are held against their will through the use or threat of violence and forced to work for little or no money. Thus, the fruits, vegetables, and meats we consume are often the product of slave labor happening in the United States. So are companies like Gibson and Fender an ethical choice when it comes to buying a guitar? They may not be engaging in forced labor, but they are definitely exploiting cheap labor wherever possible, and in some cases breaking the law in other ways. Gibson Guitar Corporation faced legal action and a settlement due to violations of the Lacey Act related to the illegal import of ebony and rosewood. The company was investigated for importing wood that was harvested in a manner that violated laws in Madagascar and India. As part of the settlement, Gibson paid a fine, made a community service payment, forfeited the seized wood, and implemented a compliance program. So what's a person to do that simply wants an affordable guitar? How do I support manufacturing in the US with my guitar purchases? Well, if you have the means, buy from small craft builders like Texas Toast or CMG Guitars to keep as much of your money in the hands of small entrepreneurs as possible. Buy used. There's a glut of used name brand guitars out there. Give them a home. And finally, work for change. Demand companies do better. Vote with your dollars. If you oppose the practices in China, don't buy Chinese-made goods. But don't limit it to just guitars, and don't oppose Chinese-made guitars only to spend your money with Fender or Gibson and have your money end up there anyway. Put your money where your mouth is. At the end of the day, I think guitars are a very small part of the overall issues with exploited labor, trade imbalance, human rights, and political conflict. When I buy a guitar, whether it was made in the US or China, an actual human put their hands on that instrument to help bring it to life. And even just a small portion of my money is going to that person. I consider myself extremely fortunate to have the means and freedom to buy pretty much whatever kind of guitar I want. Budget instruments from China and other Asian countries may be doing a lot to keep guitar playing relevant by making it accessible to people of all incomes. But I think these are good discussions to have, and we should be concerned about the people building our instruments and where our money goes when we buy them. Well, that's all for this one. Thanks again for tuning in, everybody. We'll see you next time.